that same agricultural industry, which is a war industry, I mean, Monsanto's name was only associated with war chemicals till the emergence of the new biotechnologies, which grew in universities as public research. The capacity to splice genes, move them across species barriers. The war industry, now the agrochemical industry, started to pick up the patents on those tools, and then were the ones who brought us genetically engineered seeds and crops. As you might have seen in the film called Bullshit, when the filmmakers go to Monsanto headquarters and are asking, how do you do genetic engineering? And the official is saying, we use a gene gun. And the film director saying, what do you mean, a gun? Yes, a gun. We put an explosive, a gold particle, and shoot. So it is genetic warfare at that genetic level. The only other way you can move genes across species is by infecting a plant with cancer. In this case, it's biological warfare. Can you imagine a technology whose only two bases is either a gene gun or a cancer called agrobacterium? And what have we received after all these years, 20 years? Two crops, traits: herbicide resistance, which means you spray more herbicide, and Bt toxin crops. On herbicide resistance, in this country, you now have an emergence of superweeds. 5.4 million acres have gone out of production, infested with weeds that now cannot be controlled because the herbicide-resistant trait has moved into weeds. And we knew from the beginning, we said these traits will create superweeds and superpests. In the case of genetically engineered Bt crops, like the cotton that was introduced to India, we now have the pest called the bollworm resistant to the Bt, and new pests have emerged. So 13 times more pesticide is being used. But because the second element of this control over life was patenting, genetic engineering for patenting, as the industry representatives were sitting across the table at this conference in '87, they said the reason we have to do genetic engineering is it's the only way we can start claiming patents on life. They had nothing positive to offer, but they said as long as we can introduce any gene that doesn't belong to the organism, we can now say we've created a new life form. The interesting thing, of course, is when it comes to claiming property rights on a life form by putting a toxic gene into the plant, they say never existed before, it's a novel life form, therefore I'm the creator, I'm the owner, and I should be able to collect royalty and rents. And when that same toxin starts to create problems, it starts to move through pollination and starts to spread contamination, and the issue then becomes biosafety, the safety of these new genetically modified life forms, both for the safety of the environment and our safety for human health. At that time, the same industry that has said, I've made something new, says, oh, this is just like nature made it. There's nothing new in it. I've called it ontological schizophrenia. It's new if it comes to owning, and it's same as nature if it comes to disowning the responsibility for impact. And of course the impacts are now huge. The impacts, for example, of the emergence of superweeds and superpests. The impacts of having wiped out the entire agriculture of Argentina. There's only herbicide-resistant Roundup-ready soya growing because they spray from the air. If I am a poor woman with a small kitchen garden, my garden is killed. All other crops have disappeared. Half of Argentina stands in soup lines, soup kitchen lines. The rates of food insecurity are huge. There are situations like the contamination of farmers' fields, but because you have a patent, And a patent says you can exclude anyone else from making, having, owning, selling what is patented. And the occurrence of the patented product without the permission of the patent holder is considered theft. If farmers save seed, that's considered theft. But if a farmer's field is contaminated, that's considered theft. And this very famous case of Percy Smicer, a Canadian farmer, whose fields were contaminated, canola field was contaminated. And Monsanto then said, you've stolen. How did they come to know? They sent out Pinkerton detectives who collect samples, and they said your crop on the border around the field had Roundup resistant traits. And Percy said, well, if it has, then you've polluted my field. And you should be paying up. They fined him $200,000. The case went all the way to Canadian Supreme Court. Our foundation, the Research Foundation, also intervened. And this fine was struck down. But the judges, 3 judges said, if you have patent law of this kind, then these are the kind of rights these corporations have. In the case of India, there is another kind of violence that such patenting and genetic engineering has unleashed on our farmers. Monsanto entered India in 97-98 and started to put ads in the newspapers saying they were going to be selling Bolgard, the seed, for the farmers next year. Now, I'd been looking at this from 1987 onwards, so I knew what Bolgard is. It was the BT crop. And I also knew we have laws for seed testing. We have laws for regulating introduction of genetically engineered organisms, a very, very sophisticated law, because if it was written before the days of commercialization, it was written by independent scientists, very accurate on the science, and very responsible on the accountability. But Monsanto thought, we've managed to prevent laws in the US. We've never had to take anyone's permission. I remember in 1992, while the negotiations on the Convention on Biological Diversity were going on in Rio, and I played a very big part, my government used to seek my advice, as did other third world governments, and we managed to put into the convention a clause 19.3 on biosafety. The fact that genetically engineered organisms can harm biodiversity through contamination, biopollution. And President Bush Sr. walked away without signing this agreement and said, I won't let my biotech industry suffer. Immediately after that, he got his vice president, Dan Quayle. My favorite about him is the potato. That he could spell the word. But he could spell a much more complicated word than potato, which was substantial equivalence. And that's where this false idea that it treat a genetically engineered organism as if it was natural. And this led to the policy in this country of don't look and don't see. If you assume it's the same, you're not going to see what impact it has. And that absence of testing has been treated as if it was proof of safety. From that time onwards, from 92 onwards, the world now has a biosafety protocol. We have an international law. The US is not a signatory to it. It hasn't endorsed it. But Monsanto, which had been very effective in making sure all this dismantling of regulation takes place here, thought it could do the same in India. But we filed a case in the Supreme Court of India. They were stopped. And it also put vigor into our regulatory process. It kind of became alive. It was like putting oxygen into, what was still then a paper law because it didn't have any reason to be used. We've just had a big debate in the country, a national debate on a little vegetable which is called the aubergine or the eggplant. We called it the brinjal. And Monsanto wanted now to bring a BT brinjal. And this was the first food crop that would have been engineered. We built up the movements, the government was forced to hold public hearings. I don't think a vegetable has been subject to public hearings anywhere else in the world. 7 cities, thousands of people gave evidence.